There are motorcycles that become successful. There are motorcycles that become famous. And then there are motorcycles that become something far greater, machines that become symbols. The Triumph Bonneville T120 was one of those rare motorcycles. It wasn't the fastest forever, nor the most reliable, but somehow it became a legend. A motorcycle whose name would survive generations, changing motorcycle culture along the way. At the heart of the Bonneville was a simple idea. Take Triumph's proven parallel twin engine and give it the breathing ability and performance to compete with the world's fastest motorcycles. The result was the T120, a 650 cubic centimeter British twin that would become one of the most influential motorcycles of its generation. It was relatively simple, beautifully engineered, and capable of delivering performance that made riders take notice. When the Bonneville arrived, motorcycles were changing rapidly. Riders no longer wanted machines that simply carried them from one place to another. They wanted speed, they wanted style, they wanted freedom. And Triumph understood that desire better than almost anyone. The motorcycle was becoming a statement, and Triumph was preparing one of the strongest statements yet. The biggest clue came from America. American riders had discovered British motorcycles and were demanding more performance from them. Triumph's lightweight twins were already popular across the Atlantic, but the competition was getting faster. Triumph needed an answer, and that answer would come from an engine the company already understood extremely well. Triumph already had the Thunderbird, a successful 650cc C-twin designed for fast road riding. But Triumph's engineers knew that the engine had more potential. They didn't need to reinvent everything. They simply needed to make something that already worked significantly better. That philosophy would become one of the secrets behind the Bonneville's success. The key change was the move to twin carburetors. More air and fuel could reach the cylinders, allowing the engine to produce significantly more power. It was classic British engineering, relatively simple, mechanical, and understandable, but capable of producing genuinely exciting performance. The engine wasn't complicated, it was purposeful. Triumph had created a motorcycle capable of approaching the magic figure of 120 miles per hour. And that number mattered. It wasn't merely a specification. It became the identity of the motorcycle itself. The machine would be called the Bonneville T120, a name that immediately suggested speed, adventure, and something special. The name came from the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, a place already associated with land speed records and extraordinary speed. Triumph had demonstrated its performance there, and the name captured exactly what the company wanted riders to believe. This was a motorcycle built to go fast, and it carried a name that sounded like it belonged on the world's fastest roads. In 1959, the Triumph Bonneville T120 entered production. On paper, it looked like an evolution of Triumph's existing twin, but motorcycles aren't remembered because of what appears on paper. They're remembered because of what they make people feel. And the Bonneville had something that numbers alone couldn't explain. The Bonneville looked right. The sculpted tank, the polished engine, the twin exhausts, the narrow seat, the elegant proportions. It had none of the visual aggression of later superbikes. It looked fast without needing to shout about it. There was confidence in its design, and that confidence became one of the reasons riders wanted one. More importantly, the Bonneville fitted perfectly into the culture that was emerging around motorcycles. Young riders were discovering that a motorcycle could represent independence. It wasn't simply transportation anymore. It was a statement about who you were, where you came from, and how you wanted to live. In London, places like the Ace Cafe became gathering points for young motorcyclists. Riders came for the machines, the music, the competition, and the atmosphere. Triumph motorcycles were everywhere, and the Bonneville was almost perfectly designed for this new world. It had enough performance to excite young riders and enough character to become part of the culture surrounding them. The café-racer culture transformed motorcycles into objects of performance and personality. Riders modified their machines, stripped away unnecessary parts, and chased speed between cafes. The Bonneville's powerful twin-cylinder engine made it one of the perfect foundations for that movement. It wasn't just something you rode, it was something you could build upon. The Bonneville was also beautifully simple. There were no electronic riding modes, no digital dashboard, no traction control, no computer deciding how much power you needed. There was an engine, a gearbox, two wheels, and the rider. That directness became part of its magic. Everything important was right there in front of you. The parallel twin delivered its power with a character that riders immediately recognized. It wasn't perfectly smooth. It vibrated. It pulsed. It felt mechanical. You didn't simply hear the engine running, you felt it through the motorcycle. Every pulse from the engine reminded the rider that this was a real machine doing real mechanical work. On a twisting road, that character became addictive. The Bonneville wasn't a massive motorcycle, and its engine had enough power to make every straight exciting. It could be ridden hard, but it still retained the elegance that made British motorcycles so distinctive. It was fast without feeling intimidating. It also worked as an everyday motorcycle. That mattered. The Bonneville wasn't some exotic racing machine that lived only on a track. Riders could commute on it, tour on it, modify it, race it, and simply ride it for the pleasure of riding. Its versatility allowed different kinds of riders to find something they loved about it. Across the Atlantic, the Bonneville's reputation grew even faster. America was becoming one of Triumph's most important markets, and American riders were fascinated by these relatively light British motorcycles that could deliver serious performance. The Bonneville offered something different from the big American motorcycles that dominated the roads. Compared with large American motorcycles, the Bonneville felt different. It was narrower, lighter, and more eager to turn. It offered a different kind of speed, less about enormous displacement and more about balance, response, and personality. For many riders, that difference was exactly the attraction. And riders quickly discovered another secret. The Bonneville could be turned into almost anything. Road racer, café-racer, scrambler, dirt tracker, custom. The basic machine was versatile enough to become whatever its owner imagined. That flexibility would become an enormous part of its legacy. This adaptability helped create something more powerful than a successful motorcycle. It created a platform. Owners didn't simply buy Bonneville T120s and leave them alone. They changed them, personalized them, and made them part of their own identity. Every modified Bonneville became a reflection of its owner. In garages and workshops, young mechanics experimented with gearing, exhausts, handlebars, seats, and suspension. The Bonneville became a canvas, and every modification made the motorcycle feel even more personal. The machine was no longer simply something produced by Triumph. It became something created by the rider. Racing gave the Bonneville another dimension. Triumph's road-going twin could be transformed into a serious competition machine. And every racing success reinforced the same message. This wasn't just a stylish motorcycle. It had genuine performance underneath the chrome. The beautiful appearance was backed by an engine that could deliver. There was something wonderfully primitive about the experience. The rider watched an analog needle climb. The engine became louder. The vibration increased. The road rushed toward you. And there was nothing between your hand and the throttle except a simple mechanical connection. The motorcycle responded directly to what the rider asked of it. That connection became the motorcycle's greatest strength. Modern machines would eventually become much faster, but the Bonneville offered something different. It made ordinary speeds feel meaningful because the rider was so directly involved in everything the motorcycle was doing. You didn't feel separated from the machine. You felt like part of it. Then came the cultural explosion of the 1960s. Rock music, youth rebellion, and motorcycle culture collided. Suddenly, motorcycles weren't just machines. They were symbols of independence, danger, rebellion, and freedom. And Triumph was perfectly positioned for that moment. Triumph motorcycles looked British, sounded distinctive, and carried an unmistakable sense of attitude. The Bonneville became part of the visual language of the era. It appeared in photographs, around cafes, on roads, and in popular culture. Its image became almost as powerful as its performance. Hollywood helped push that image around the world. British motorcycles began appearing in films and photographs, and the Bonneville became increasingly associated with the rebellious image of the young rider. It was becoming more than a motorcycle. It was becoming a cultural object. The important thing wasn't whether every famous rider actually owned a Bonneville. The important thing was what the motorcycle represented. It represented the idea that a motorcycle could be stylish, fast, individual, and rebellious all at once. That image would stay with the Bonneville long after its original era had ended. By the middle of the 1960s, the Bonneville had become one of Triumph's defining products. It had moved beyond being simply another model in a catalog. The name Bonneville itself now carried an expectation. When people heard the name, they knew what kind of motorcycle they were talking about. But success created its own problems. Triumph was still a traditional British manufacturer. Production methods were becoming increasingly difficult to compete with, while Japanese manufacturers were preparing an assault that would change the motorcycle industry forever. Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, and Kawasaki were approaching motorcycles differently. They brought mass production, engineering precision, and rapidly improving technology. Their machines were becoming smoother, faster, and increasingly reliable. The world was moving quickly, and the old British motorcycle industry was about to discover how difficult it was to keep up. Suddenly, the Bonneville's imperfections mattered more. The British twin still had character, but character couldn't stop a motorcycle from leaking oil. It couldn't make electrical systems perfect, and it couldn't prevent vibration from shaking loose hardware. These were small issues in one era, but they became major disadvantages in another. The old Triumph formula had always involved some compromise. Owners accepted maintenance because they loved the machine. But the new Japanese motorcycles were changing what riders expected from a motorcycle. People were beginning to expect reliability and convenience alongside performance. A Bonneville owner learned the machine. You checked things, you adjusted things, you listened to the engine, you carried tools. For some riders, that was part of the experience. For others, it was becoming unacceptable. The motorcycle industry was beginning to divide between those who loved mechanical involvement and those who wanted modern convenience. Yet despite everything changing around it, the Bonneville continued to attract loyal riders. Because a motorcycle can survive technological competition if people become emotionally attached to it. And people were deeply attached to the Bonneville. They loved its sound, they loved the shape, they loved the way the engine delivered power. Most of all, they loved the feeling that riding one was an experience rather than merely operating a machine. That emotional connection would prove more durable than the motorcycle's original technology. That connection became increasingly important as Triumph's business struggled. The company had produced one of the most recognizable motorcycles in the world, but the motorcycle industry was becoming an unforgiving place. Being iconic didn't automatically make a company financially healthy. Britain itself was going through industrial turmoil. Manufacturing problems, financial pressure, and labor disputes damaged the country's motorcycle industry. Triumph's story became part of a much larger story, the decline of Britain's once dominant motorcycle manufacturing empire. The Bonneville was still there, still recognizable, still desirable, but the world around it had changed. Riders now had more choices than ever, and many of those choices were faster, smoother, and easier to live with. The motorcycle that once represented the future was beginning to represent the past. The Japanese manufacturers had not simply copied British motorcycles, they had moved the entire industry forward. Four-cylinder engines, electric starters, disc brakes, and improved reliability were changing expectations. The old British twins suddenly belonged to another era. And yet, something strange happened. Instead of disappearing completely, the Bonneville began to acquire something even more powerful than commercial success. It became a symbol of a disappearing world. A world of British engineering, chrome tanks, mechanical engines, and motorcycles that demanded participation from their riders. For enthusiasts, that imperfection became part of the charm. The Bonneville didn't hide its mechanical nature. It celebrated it. You could see the engine, you could hear the engine, you could work on the engine, and that made ownership feel more personal than simply buying a modern machine and pressing a button. Custom builders also helped keep the motorcycle alive. Old Bonnevilles could be rebuilt, modified, and transformed. Every generation of riders found a different way to interpret the same basic machine. The Bonneville survived because it could be reinvented without losing its identity. Café racers made the Bonneville faster and more focused. Scramblers made it tougher. Custom builders made it more personal. The motorcycle's basic architecture was flexible enough to survive changes in fashion. That adaptability was something many other motorcycles of its era simply didn't possess. Eventually, the original T120 became something more than an old motorcycle. It became an artifact, a physical connection to the moment when British motorcycles stood at the center of global motorcycle culture. Owning one meant owning a piece of that story. Collectors began preserving them. Enthusiasts restored them. Riders searched for original examples. And suddenly, all those imperfections that once hurt Triumph's reputation became part of the machine's authenticity. The very things that made the old motorcycle difficult were now part of what made it special. Triumph itself eventually returned to the Bonneville name in a completely new era. The original motorcycle had disappeared, but its identity had never really gone away. The name still had power. It still meant something to riders. The modern Bonneville wasn't simply the old T120 brought back unchanged. It was a reinterpretation, but the philosophy remained familiar. A beautiful parallel twin, classic proportions, and an emphasis on the emotional side of motorcycling. That is perhaps the greatest proof of the original T120's influence. Decades after its birth, manufacturers were still using the same basic visual language because riders still responded to it. The formula had survived because it touched something deeper than technology. Few motorcycle names have survived across generations with such consistency. The Bonneville name became bigger than one model year, one engine, or one factory. It became a language of its own. A language understood by riders who might otherwise have almost nothing in common. And that language still says the same thing it said in 1959. Speed without unnecessary aggression, style without excess, and mechanical character without pretending to be something it isn't. The Bonneville never needed to look futuristic. Its strength was that it looked timeless. The Bonneville also represented freedom in a very particular way. Not the freedom to ride faster than everyone else, but the freedom to disappear down a road with nothing between you and the machine. That simple idea is one of the reasons the motorcycle has remained emotionally relevant. You heard the twin. You felt the vibration. You smelled the fuel and hot metal. You shifted the gears yourself. Every part of the experience reminded you that you were riding a machine, not simply controlling a computer. That physical relationship is difficult to measure, but impossible for riders to forget. The T120 also proved that performance doesn't have to mean complexity. Its basic formula was remarkably straightforward. A strong parallel twin, a lightweight chassis, 2 wheels, and enough power to make the road interesting. It was an honest machine. Today, original Bonneville T120s are treasured because they capture a particular moment in motorcycle history. A moment before electronics transformed the motorcycle. Before computers became part of the riding experience. Before horsepower numbers became almost absurd. Put the T120 beside a modern superbike and the difference is almost comical. The modern machine will destroy it in acceleration, braking, and cornering. But that misses the point completely. The Bonneville isn't remembered because it won every performance test. It is remembered because it made riders want to keep riding after the test was over. That is the difference between a motorcycle that was successful and a motorcycle that became legendary. Success belongs to numbers. Legend belongs to memory. The T120 crossed countries, generations, and cultures. It became British in the eyes of the world, American in the hands of American riders, rebellious in popular culture, and timeless in the garages of collectors. Very few motorcycles can claim that kind of cultural reach. The T120 became a legend, not because it was perfect, but because it arrived at exactly the right moment. The world wanted speed. Young riders wanted freedom. Britain wanted a motorcycle that could represent both. Triumph gave them the Bonneville. The name Bonneville came to represent far more than a place in Utah. It became shorthand for a certain kind of motorcycle, elegant, fast, mechanical, and unmistakably British. That identity became so powerful that it survived even when the original company and industry around it struggled. More than 6 decades later, the original idea still makes sense. A motorcycle doesn't need the biggest engine. It doesn't need the most technology. Sometimes it simply needs the right proportions, the right sound, and the ability to make a rider smile. A 650cc British twin became a racing machine, a café-racer icon, a symbol of rebellion, a cultural phenomenon, and eventually one of the most recognizable names in motorcycle history. The T120 didn't just survive its era, it escaped it. So why did the Triumph Bonneville T120 become a legend? Because it arrived when motorcycles were becoming more than transportation. It gave riders speed, style, freedom, and identity in one unforgettable machine. Technology moved on, companies changed, generations disappeared. But the sound of that British twin never truly left. And that is why the Bonneville T120 isn't simply a motorcycle from history. It is a piece of motorcycle history that still feels alive. Because the greatest motorcycles aren't remembered only for what they could do. They're remembered for how they made people feel. And the Triumph Bonneville T120 made an entire generation feel free.